I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards the land and the great privilege we have to work on this land. I am delighted to welcome Professor Timothy Snyder to speak on the topic, What Next After the American Election? Let me tell you a little bit about Timothy if you don't know him. Professor Timothy Snyder has been the Richard C. Levin Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University and is a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. You'll notice my tenses because I'm delighted to report that Professor Snyder is now a professor and chair in modern Eastern Europe here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy in the University of Toronto. As well, I'm equally delighted to say he is also the Massey Munk Global Scholar and senior resident here in the college, and we've had lunch with him a fair bit lately. He is a scholar of history, of the history of Central and Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and the Holocaust, and he speaks five and reads 10 European languages, has written 16 books, including 6 on Ukraine, and co-edited 2. His work, published in 40 languages, has inspired political demonstrations, sculpture, posters, punk rock, rap, film, theater, opera, and earned him 6 state orders and decorations from Austria, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, as well as 4 honorary doctorates, and many other prizes too numerous to list. Snyder writes and speaks in the international press on Ukraine, American politics, strategies for averting authoritarianism, digital politics, health, and education, also appearing in documentaries, on network television, and major films, and is an expert witness to Congress. He also seems to be showing up as quoted by everybody in the newspapers these days. He is an ambassador to United 24, where he launched the Safe Skies Fund for Military Defense of Ukraine. His books include Unfreedom, which was just published in September, and he will sign it for you after this event if you wish to have your purchase books signed, and I encourage you all to purchase a book. He has published a book called Our Malady, Lessons in Liberty from a Hospital Diary, The Road to Unfreedom, Russia, Europe, America in 2018, and On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, written in 2017, with an audio edition adding 20 lessons from Russia's war on Ukraine in 2022, and a graphic edition illustrated by Nora Krug in 2021. Please join me in welcoming Timothy Snyder.
Thank you very much. So something serious has happened, and we are here to talk about that serious thing. The fact that something serious has happened, that is to say, Donald Trump the fact that something serious has happened, that is to say, Donald Trump has been elected for a second time to President of the United States, doesn't mean that we can't be playful. On the contrary, I think it's very important in serious moments to allow oneself a certain amount of room to try to figure out what's going on. There's plenty of time and space to be despondent, and you're welcome to do that now in public if you'd like to. As Jonathan mentioned, also in front of the internet, where it will be recorded forever. But there's also the various ways we have to stretch ourselves to try to understand. So I'm going to try to make. So here's what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to spend most of my time with you trying to make a serious case for, or a serious attempt at an explanation of what has happened. And then I'll say a few things at the end about where I think things might go next. I'm assuming that in your questions, both you who are here in person and those of you who write in questions, that your questions will have to do with what comes next. And so I'm looking forward to hearing from which angle those questions come, rather than trying to talk about the whole world at once. So I'm going to give you an analysis which I'm thinking of as the 10 I's. The 10 I's are impulse, incumbency, impunity, immunity, information, intersectionality, interests, ideology, and inequality, and also the international. Each of these contains a bit of an argument for why things turned out the way that they did. Let me start from impulse. So impulse is very important because it's when Americans went to the polls, as some of us do every 4 years to vote for president, what people are doing when they vote is so overdetermined. What that vote means is so layered, right? There's so many things that go into what that vote means, and we only get to vote once. So in saner systems, if you don't get a majority, then you have a second round. Note, and this is rather important to what I'm going to be saying, Donald Trump did not get a majority. So in a different sort of system, we would now be having a second round in which I think it's very likely Harris would have won. And the reason why I think that is this impulse business. I think so much of what goes into a vote for president of the United States is extra political or only quasi-political. Our elections last for so long, the campaigns last for so long, that practically every element of everyone's life is bound into them by the time they happen. And so what I'm just trying to suggest is that this very narrow victory in which he didn't get a majority, which would have flipped if 110,000 or so people in 3 states had voted in a different way, that this very narrow victory is partly a matter of that moment, that time, how everyone felt. Or another way to put this, I think if Harris had had 50 days to run her campaign instead of 100, she would have won. I think if she had had 200 instead of 100, she might very well have won as well. I think the length of the campaign was probably just wrong as far as she was concerned. Okay, so there's the impulse, and I start with that partly because I don't want us to over-explain things. Right? What we're trying to explain is not some big shift to the right in U.S. politics, which didn't happen. We're not trying to explain how Trump got more votes than he got last time because he didn't get that many more votes. We're trying to explain how it is that 77 million people could vote for Donald Trump. That's where I'm after. That's all I'm trying to explain. So we don't want to overdo it. Second I is incumbency. So those of you who follow politics, and I'm looking nervously for actual political scientists in the crowd, you can tell who they are because they didn't laugh when I said that, because political science is a very serious business and a very serious self-identification. As you might have noticed, this has been a very tough year for incumbents in general, and it's been a tough few years for incumbents in general. And I think the fact that Harris was regarded overwhelmingly as the incumbent made this an uphill struggle for her. If you look at the polling, Harris was regarded as a person who cares, and Trump was not. But if you ask who is going to change things, it was overwhelmingly Trump, like 80-20 for Trump. So what change means is a broad question, but for people who are looking for change, that was going to be Trump rather than Harris. And of course, there are all kinds of ironies in this, and I want to point to 2. The first is that, in a sense, Trump was being rewarded for being a bad president the first time. In that this anti-incumbency thing has a lot to do with COVID and the economic aftershocks of COVID. So if we had handled, that's my American we, if we had handled COVID better the first time around, there would have been smaller economic aftershocks to be dealing with years down the road, right? But by the time we get to late Biden, everybody in America has forgotten that Trump was president at that time. I'm not kidding. You may have noticed this about us, right? We don't remember things for a very long time. You're too polite to acknowledge the truth of what I just said, so I'll just nod for you. Yes, as though you were all nodding because it's true, and you know it's true. So in a way, Trump was rewarded for his own failure I think, in 2020 with COVID. Another irony is that the people who wanted change overwhelmingly say they wanted what Biden was doing, but more of it, right? And so Biden was being punished not for his agenda, but for the fact that a couple of Democrats didn't actually vote for his policies, and in a very close Congress, he had trouble getting certain things across the line, right? So there's another irony there, which is that Biden was being punished for trying to do the things that people actually, in general, wanted. And so this is something that a lot of Trump's voters, if you look, like they wouldn't say this about themselves. They wouldn't use these buzzwords I'm about to use. But if you look at their policy preferences, a lot of them are social democrats who are in favor of the welfare state on pure social policy, right? Not on culture necessarily, but a lot of them are in favor of distribution and this sort of thing. And they didn't think they were getting enough of it from Biden. Now you can see the irony of this. The irony of this is obvious because, of course, Trump is a wannabe billionaire who will surround himself with billionaires and so forth, but we're not going to go there yet. We're just going to try to figure out what happened. Okay, third factor, impunity. And I think impunity is a major factor, not just in American, but in world politics now. So I'm just take a brief skip to the side and then I'll come back. One of the ways Ukrainians describe the Russian war against Ukraine is crime without punishment and punishment without crime. Right? So they're being punished without crime, but what the Russians are doing is a crime without punishment. Right? And this, I think, is a key to understanding both the possibility but also the charisma of someone like Trump. Because Trump is someone who has committed a whole bunch of crimes, right? And there's no way I'm going to be sued for saying this. He was convicted of 34 felonies. And he committed a whole bunch of crimes besides that, right? The man committed crime after crime after crime after crime, including some of the most serious crimes you can imagine, like attempting to overthrow the constitutional system of his own country, right? That's a fairly serious crime. He tried to steal an election, right? He called up, for example, he called up the state of Georgia and asked them to find 12,000 votes for him, right? That's a pretty serious crime. And the trick here is that if you commit crimes and get away with it, then it seems like you're somebody who is beyond the law. Then it seems like you're some kind of hero, right? You're someone to whom the normal rules don't apply. And so when I say impunity, I don't just mean this in a normal sense that he wasn't punished and therefore he could run for office, although that, of course, is a big deal. I mean something more than that. I mean the fact that the bullets seem to bounce off him makes him seem like a hero to a lot of people, and it makes him, I'm going to speak more about this later, but it makes him seem like the kind of hustler you need to be in an unfair world. And there's a lesson here, I think, for people on the left, which is that, and you see, that's an obvious lesson, right? Is it? No, it's not a lesson. Okay, so the lesson for people on, it's not. Nothing is obvious if you're on the left, right? No, like that's, I say it with love. But the obvious lesson here is that there has to be a limit to I'm okay, you're okay, right? Like attempting to overthrow the government has to somehow be beyond the line of what's okay. And the difficulty that people on the left have in articulating clear moral judgments about high politics. You can articulate clear moral judgments about other things, right? But about high politics in your own country, that can come back to haunt you, right? So there were just 4 years of ineffectual attempts to prosecute somebody who's committed the greatest crimes in the United States since the Civil War. 4 years. And you can point to this technicality and that bad judgment. But behind it all is a lack of resolution for which the right is not responsible, but the left, I believe, is responsible. Okay. Number 4, related, immunity. So technically, one of the reasons why Trump could get through these 4 years without being prosecuted was because he has behind him a Supreme Court which has been engineered carefully over the years to guide us towards a theoplutocratic type system. It's a Supreme Court which has 3 judges he appointed, plus 2 he didn't appoint, but who legally should have recused themselves in cases involving the January 6th insurrection because either they or their spouses or both were directly involved. So by a Supreme Court majority, which by any traditional standard has to be regarded as corrupt, he was given something entirely new with this presidential immunity business, which made the prosecutions harder. But the immunity is only an illustration of the way the Supreme Court generally cleared the path for the possibility of this presidency. It's one example, it's not the only example. An equally clear example is the Supreme Court choosing to void, which who knew the Supreme Court could do this, right? It's such an interesting century we're in, but the Supreme Court chose to void a provision of our Constitution, which I'm not sure like how that goes along with this whole originalist thing, which they like, but the 14th Amendment, the third clause, prohibits insurrectionists from running for office. And all the Supreme Court had to do was make the obvious factual judgment that this was an insurrectionist and say, therefore, he can't run from office. But they didn't do that. And it was on a 9-0 majority, refer back to my earlier thing I said about the left. So the insurrectionist was allowed to get away with it by the 9 people with the robes. There are other things the Supreme Court did as well along the way, like clearing the way for money in politics, so that we could have a situation where a single donor, Elon Musk, a single donor could give more money than all of the small donors put together. Right, and that's what do we say about that? The single donor also does things like have a lottery and like give out big checks, But the Supreme Court paves the way for that. The Supreme Court also has generally allowed states to suppress votes, and that's so hard to see, but it has probably a great deal to do with this outcome. Okay, but immunity and impunity together, they create not only this landscape of possibility, but also the sense that this man is beyond the law. And that's the kind of candidate he is, not for all of his voters, but for, let's say, half of them. The appeal is precisely that he is a kind of heroic figure who is beyond the law, who they can't touch. Fifth I is information. So here are just a few things about where people actually, or where Americans actually spend their time. We spend most of our time in front of screens. And I think that gives an advantage to certain kinds of politics. I think there's an inherent right word, or if you prefer is the right word here, fascist swing to this, because social media tends to push people in the direction of you like it, you're afraid of it, right? That's the behaviorist algorithm that it all relies on. And that generates a sense of us and them. It generates a clarity about who you are, that clarity depends upon clarity of who the enemy is. So social media in general, I think, pushes in that direction. But there are more specific things one can say, like that we can see how people are essentially living in closed systems. So I can say whatever I say on Twitter, but it doesn't really matter. I can try really hard to say things to reach Republicans on Twitter, but it doesn't really matter because it isn't going to reach them. Not that way. I would literally have a better chance shouting from the rooftops. Funny that sounds, or tin can telephone, or knocking on the wall. I would have a better chance reaching people because Twitter is designed to make sure, not just me personally, although also me personally, it's designed to make sure that sort of thing can't happen. But beyond the siloing, there's also just the sheer fact that empirically, the big platforms are right-wing. So Twitter's right-wing. The only place that Harris did well was TikTok, it's juiced very hard. They worked very hard on TikTok. But aside from TikTok and newspapers, everywhere beyond that, consumers of other media went for Trump. But there's a more specific thing I'm trying to get to, which is that in the new media landscape of podcasts, which Trump dominates. If your source of news is podcasts, Trump absolutely dominates, and the podcast zone is absolutely dominated by the right wing, just in terms of the sheer numbers. So there are all these advantages of the way people get information, which pushed towards a Trump victory. And again, that's before we even get to the specific things that people got wrong. And this is just the very simple thing. One way to measure all this is that if you ask people empirical questions about the United States of America, the ones who, I'm going to be a terrible elitist now, I'm going to show you that I believe in right and wrong and facts and so on. But if you ask people factual questions like, these are true examples, are we at a historical high in urban crime rates? The people who get that question wrong vote for Trump, and the people who get it right vote for, and if you ask for Harris, if you ask, do we have more or fewer border crossings now than we did in a year X? The people who get it right vote for Harris, and so on and so forth, right? And that's one way of illustrating this, but it really only scratches the surface, because so much of the information is actually about setting moods, setting parameters, creating personality styles that lead people in a Trumpy direction. What's the Trumpy direction? This leads me to point 6, which is intersectionality. Okay, what's intersectionality? I'm just wondering, does anybody know what intersectionality is? What's that? No, I'm just like, really? No, I'm just like, I don't know. I don't know like which, what's that?
Connection between different identities.
Okay, so an overlap, right? So if you're, so usually, so in the way it comes out of the social science is that like if you're black, that means that's one thing. If you're a woman, that's another thing. But being a black woman is something which is an intersection of black and woman, which can't be reduced to either black or woman, right? So I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. See, this is not shocking since you're like, the intersectionality is just some crazy American thing, doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm taking this in a different direction, right? So the intersectionality that matters for Trump is you're white, you're a male, right? And that generates something which can't be reduced to white or male. And then you add in class, you're white, you're male, and you have a high school education, right? And that particular demographic just thrills for Trump. He won that demographic overwhelmingly, including young men, right? So he did very well among young men, especially, but not only young white men, right? And so there's an overlap here of a certain kind of person who tended to vote for Trump. And it's not just the quantity, it's also the quality, right? That the vibe of the campaign, the enthusiasts behind the campaign tended to be in this space. And what do I mean by the quality? Well, and here I'm gonna lean into a feminist analysis of this, because it's not just that men, it's that the message towards them had to do with their own fragility and weakness. So there's a compensatory quality to the Trump messaging towards men, which is you're threatened by women. You're afraid of women, aren't you? You're threatened by transsexual people. You're afraid of them, aren't you? Right? And so the masculinity which is in question here is a compensatory kind of masculinity. There's a fragility here which is very evident, because after all, if you're not threatened by these things, then the message is not reaching you, right? And so with the intersectionality thing, I'm also trying to get towards a certain quality of masculinity. And this, of course, this is a little bit diffuse and it's hard to put one's finger on it, but there's clearly something going on whereby men who feel threatened are spoken to by this man who is himself a kind of walking overcompensation, right? And who embodies all of this, right? A man who's failed at everything, but who nevertheless has succeeded, right? A man whose language appeals to your weakness while at the same time somehow appears to be strong, right? That there's something there which I think has worked very well. Okay, 6. Interests. So I'm not going to go very quickly on interests. I'm going to go very quickly on interests because my basic idea here is that everybody votes against them, which makes it hard for political scientists and economists and so on. Like everybody, as a first approximation in American elections, everybody votes against their own interests. The red states vote not to take money from the blue states. The blue states vote to give money to the red states. The people who make more than $100,000 a year vote to transfer their money to the people who make less, who in turn vote against receiving it. No, that's what just happened, and happens every election. But it was striking in this one. If you go by income, the only group that Harris did better in than Biden was 100,000 plus annual income a year. That's the only group she did better than Biden, right? the group and you know the so anyway, so it's very hard to break this down in terms of economic interests. Like, people sweat over this, but it's really hard to do. It's like insecurity, precarity, perception, right, for sure, but economic interest doesn't work very well. One thing which I think does matter, though, is the sense of, it's a different kind of rhythm, right? So if you're in a social contract mode or a rational choice mode, what you want is for people to be voting because they think we could all do better, or at least some of us could do better. But if you're in a Girardian mode or a fascist mode, you'll also be comfortable with the idea that I'm going to vote to hurt myself because I really enjoy watching you hurt more. And that is a way of doing things in the world which has a lively political history. And I think a fair amount of that is at play here. Not for all Trump voters, but I think for a lot. The whole idea, which is something people say in American English all the time, the whole idea of owning the libs is very important here. So owning the libs means there are these liberals out there, they're trying to do good for all of us, but they're just but we want to just stop them from doing that. Like, we just enjoy preventing things from working. We prefer not to have health insurance just so we can make sure that those liberals don't give it to us, right? And then that wasn't a laugh line. That wasn't a laugh line. Yeah, okay, well, you put your nice welfare state up for referendum and see what happens. That's all. So, uneasy laughter. Uneasy laughter is what you need right there. Okay, so there is that, right? There's that logic, which isn't of interest, but it's about the distribution of pain. We want people to be in a mode where it's about the distribution of goods, where I can agree I'll do better, and you're also going to do better because we can find some contractual, some rational way of going about that. But there's another way of thinking, which is that I don't mind doing a little bit worse because I want to see you people do even worse than me. And Trump promises that, right? Trump promises that. Which brings me to number 7, which is ideology. So, to paraphrase the title of my colleague Jason Stanley's book, fascism does work. Fascism isn't just it's not some historical phenomenon. It's not just an appellation for people who don't like. Fascism is a form of politics which actually works. So, for example, if I threaten you with deportation, that may make you vote for me. No, come on. No, because what is the reasoning? The reasoning is that if I show my adoration for you, right? Like if I yield to you, if I go down on my knees, if I bow, then you will have mercy on me, right? So the threat of deportation certainly did not hurt Trump with Latino men. There was a 33-point swing. A 33-point swing from 2020 to 2024 among Latino men in the United States. 33% towards Trump, 33%. The largest, most notable swing. So clearly the threat of deportation did not affect Latino men the way one might have predicted. And of course, there are other kinds of rationales here too. Like, you can say, well, these were citizens, and therefore they're hoping that they think it's not going to be them. But I would say that's the same rationale, because what you're saying is, I'm with the tribe. Of course, the next ones, let them suffer. But I'm with the tribe. I want to show you that I'm with the tribe by voting with you, right? So, but that's just one example of how fascism works, right? The threat that bad things can be about to happen can lead people to do things which generate votes, like, for example, billionaires who own American newspapers. So both the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times are owned by billionaires, both of whom blocked the endorsements of their editorial boards at the last moment. Why did they do that? They did that because they were afraid. They were afraid of consequences, right? So the threat that somehow they're going to lose and the irony of that, of course, is that, not to put a too fine point on it, but like the billionaires are not going to be first in line, right? In the Trump administration, like these are the people who literally have the least to lose. But nevertheless, the threat that something could happen to their press or to their other businesses means that they preemptively, right? And so this is a way in which fascism can work. And another way that fascism works, and this is not only on the right, you can see this also a little bit on the far left, is the idea of burning it all down, or as the more polite people on the hopeful far left say, he's going to shake things up, right? He's not going to shake things up, right? Or to put it a different way, aside from a few drinks, there are trained bartenders in this audience, at least one. Aside from a few drinks, there aren't that many things that benefit from being shaken up, paint cans. But like this whole shake things up is a hopeful metaphor that people are now applying generally from the left. Like, oh yeah, maybe having vaccine deniers in charge of our various health centers is gonna, no, that I'm quoting now, that's gonna shake things up. Look at, you can find that, Google it afterwards, you'll find Americans saying that. It's gonna shake things up. So our immune systems are a good example of something that doesn't need to be shaken up, right? There are very few, but the point here is that there's a fascist fantasy, which isn't only a fascist fantasy, but it is a fascist fantasy, that if you burn it all down, then somehow something good will come of it, right? You need to burn it all down, you need to start it all again. So these various ideas, and you don't have to call them fascist, but they're certainly ideological, they're visions. I think those actually did end up affecting the election. So or to put it a different way, a lot of the things that people like me, who warn against regime change in the United States, would like to think would deter people from voting for Trump, don't necessarily deter people from voting for Trump, right? These things might actually attract people to voting for Trump. Okay, not final. What's the word for before penultimate? No, that's wrong. Before penultimate, anti-penultimate. 0 points for the crowd. So the very important one is inequality. So inequality means a lot of things here. One is 50 years of flat income for most Americans, which coincides with the collapse of much of what we used to have as a welfare state, which means that even people who are, by salary, would seem very comfortably in the middle class, if you just look at the numbers in a Canadian way, are actually living quite precariously because the moment they get sick, they're wiped out, right? And so there's flat income. And then the flat income is combined with extraordinarily absurd and grotesque levels of hoarding at the very top, right? So while the median is flat, at the top you have these absurd accumulations of wealth, which have their own consequences. Like they affect the entire. I mean, it's hard. Again, this is a little bit hard to specify, but it changes the whole speech environment. It changes the whole way that newspapers write. It changes the whole way that the culture works. Like the cult of billionaires is an easy example here. It's low-hanging fruit, right? That we worship them regardless of how obviously insane, destructive, and drug-addled they are. But there's a larger point in which the ancient Greeks understood, which is that if you have radical inequality of wealth, people will be reduced to client groups huddling around patrons, and nobody will tell the truth to anyone else along any axis in that situation, which makes democracy hard. But it means that politics becomes this kind of cluster of oligarchs fighting one among themselves. And if I can switch analogies here just for a second and lean a little bit into what might happen next, this reminds me quite a lot, shifting from Greek oligarch to Russian, oligarch. It reminds me a lot of Russia in the 1990s, for those of you who remember that, where you have an aging, increasingly doddering president surrounded by slightly more lively oligarchs who are thinking about a succession plan. And so you have oligarchs against president, oligarchs against one another, rival successors in the background. That's a bit what our system looks like today. But the inequality ends up favoring Trump for all kinds of reasons. Thanks to the Supreme Court, it means that you could have big donors supply lots of money. Thanks to this combination of precarity and stupendous wealth, you have this fantasy, especially among men. This is very powerful, and this also goes together with the podcasts. this fantasy among men of hustling your way to success, right? Where the ideal person is no longer the small businessman, right, or the athlete, but the hustler, the grifter, like the person who works outside the law or at the edge of the law, right? Inequality favors that fantasy, and that fantasy is right where Trump is, because that is who he is. That is who he is. He's someone who's broken the law his entire life, gotten away with it, and somehow managed at the end of it to be president of the United States twice. Like, it's exactly that story. And with no skills except grifting, right? Which it turns out is a very important skill. Not that you should have a major in it, or like Massey should have like junior fellows in griftology, but what I'm trying to say is that's one way that inequality shapes the culture. It's shaped the culture such that it's natural that somebody like Mr. Trump would seem like a kind of hero, right? That would seem like the way to make it, because there's a logic to this, because it's so hard to make it otherwise. Like Americans, I'm sure you know these statistics. Americans born in 1945 had about a 90% chance of making more money than their parents. Americans born in 1985 had about a 50-50 chance, and it's gone down ever since then, right? And so from the point of view of the average person, and this is very gendered too, so from the point of view of the average man, the idea that you can just play by the rules and live the American dream seems more and more absurd. Hence the possibility. Hence the way the quantity becomes quality, right? The quantity of inequality becomes the quality of who the ideal sort of politician would be. Okay, I miscounted at some point. At some point I've miscounted, either at the beginning or by the end, because I only have one more, which is the international. And this may seem minor, but it blends into the next part of our conversation, because I think it's going to be more important or more visible as time goes on in this Trump regime. Then that is the international. And this has to do, of course, with the inequality, because one of the ways that people preserve their wealth is by parking it in various tax-free zones. American billionaires basically don't pay taxes for a lot of reasons. But another way it's hooked up to oligarchy is again, something that Aristotle pointed out and the ancient Greeks knew, which is that an oligarch in one country is more likely to identify with and cooperate with oligarchs in other countries than with the people of his own country. And we've got this, right? Like, what country do Elon Musk and Peter Thiel really belong to? Or for that matter, what country does Vladimir Putin really belong to, right? Or for what country does Trump actually belong to? These are not people who really belong to countries. These are people who belong to one another, and whose relationships to one another, confusing as they might be, are more important than their relationships with the voters. So that the international comes into the oligarchic. There's also this little question, which might turn out to be a bigger question. We'll see, but the fact that to put it in a negative way, nobody abroad was interfering on Kamala Harris's behalf. She didn't have that kind of friends. Whereas the Russians were, it's already a tradition, like this has been going on for a decade. The Russians were warping the conversation, aiming their bots at MAGA, introducing fake videos which would reinforce Trump's idea that the Democrats were stealing the election. And on election night itself, and this is something which is just so bizarre that immediately we had to forget it, but the Russians made phone calls or sent emails to about 50 electoral precincts, all of which were African-American / Democrat majority, with bomb threats. So yes. Already forgotten, right? So this obvious, blatant, quasi-violent intervention in our elections, which probably didn't matter. We just don't have any way to pick up the pieces, right? If there's a bomb threat, people clear out, right? If there's a bomb threat, right? So that's something never to say in the middle of your lecture, right? But if there's a bomb threat right now, you're going to clear out, and we're not going to have Q&A, And if you were in line to vote, as you would be in America, because we pretty much all have to wait in line, if you were in line and there was a bomb threat, you're probably not coming back. Maybe some of you are, right? So thousands and thousands and thousands of votes were lost that way, and there's no way to get them back. But not that would have been decisive, but it's this the general point that the international, or the oligarchical international, because Putin, of course, along with Musk, is probably the richest person in the world. The oligarchical international was on Trump's side. Okay, so before we have the questions, I'm just going to push out a few implications of what this might mean. I hope that some of them are self-evident, because in trying to describe what happened, I'm also trying to describe the country as it is. But just a few reflections, and I'm not going to get into specifics because I want the specifics to come from you, but a few reflections. One is that a lot is going to depend upon pace. So I think, as those of you who know my work will know, I think that Trump is out to change the American regime. Whether this will be possible, I think, depends in large measure on how quickly he gets out of the gate. And that in turn depends upon things that are already happening now, attempts to inflict defeats on him now, to slow him down, to make him follow various kinds of procedures. So I think a lot depends on pace, and pace in turn depends upon people understanding that there is a threat. A second reflection about this would be a lot is going to depend upon whether people get the appetite for pain. So in my very rough estimation, roughly half of Trump's voters are of the we want to make it hurt for everybody variety, and roughly half of Trump's voters are of the it wasn't working out for us under Biden/Harris variety. We want some change, that sort of thing. Which of those ends up being on top matters a lot. If Trump succeeds in inflicting a lot of pain that a lot of people like quickly, that's going to help him. And the way that he's going to try to do that is with the deportations. So the deportations are not there to deport people, is my view. We can discuss it. Deporting 11 million people is a logistical operation, as the Nazis discovered. I couldn't help but be like reading today about Trump approaching, where was it? Was it the Barbados? Like Trump approaching various third countries to try to deport people in the United States. I couldn't help but be reminded of Madagascar. Like those of you who know the history of the Holocaust will know that in that colonial age, European powers had this habit of looking for countries in Africa or elsewhere that they would park people they didn't want to have in their own countries. And so Madagascar was discussed by French people, Polish people, and eventually German people as a place to put Jews, right? That's just, okay, close excursus. The point is that it's not that easy to deport 11 million people. That's a large number of people. It will cost like $300 billion. In principle, there are procedures you have to go by, and someone else has to take them. And that's not that easy. So I don't think it's actually, I think the difference, and so Trump, incidentally, I mean, this is something to remember, Biden deported a lot of people, and Obama deported a lot of people, right? Trump didn't actually deport as many people as they did the first time around, just for the record. But they deported people who were near the border. What Trump is proposing to do is to go into cities, especially Democratic-run cities, which is most of them, and in a visible, spectacular way, pull people out of their lives, right? So what he's proposing to do is to change the overall atmosphere of American society, and we will either go along with that and enjoy it, or we won't. And I think a lot depends upon that. I think the deportation is meant to be a spectacular act. And the third thing, again, to keep this very general, is whether he manages to bring things to a focus in some kind of real or fake emergency. So I was frankly very encouraged by South Korea the other day because martial law was declared and people said no, right? And that, of course, is an option, right? You can say no. In the U.S., the Trump hero cult and the fear, but also I think a certain kind of like built-in indecisiveness among a lot of folks who are not on Trump's side, leads us to react to the threat of so we have something called the Insurrection Act, which is an accumulation of laws from 1792 to 1871, which allows the president, in principle, after an invitation from the states, to send in the military to enforce laws. But it's very vaguely worded, and one could, in principle, invoke it at any time to do anything with it. One thing Americans haven't really realized is that he could say that and we could all just say no, and that's just not the kind of country we want to be in. We've backed ourselves into this fearful corner where we know he's very likely to do it because he keeps talking about it, and he was talking about it to his aides in his first term as well. But will he succeed in doing something like that, and if so, how do we react to it? That seems to me also, like if he gets away with an early emergency, then I think we're in trouble. Okay, so I tried to limit this to the structural things, the time and the emergencies and the spectacle, because I wanted to leave the conversation open for what might happen along policy lines, if that's the word, and in American society more broadly, to the questions, because I'm very interested in hearing what you're worried about, where you're coming from, how, and also just how you see all of this, which is undoubtedly different from how I do. So thank you very much. Sorry, of what?
A long history of illiberalism in the United States, xenophobia, misogyny, racism, et cetera, et cetera. To what extent is Trump unique or different from that very long history of illiberalism? Is he a new phenomenon or a culmination in many ways of what American history has in fact been?
I mean, I think it's see all the above. Like, it's not, you can't really choose between those two things. It's not that he's new and it's not that he's old. It's clearly both. So, as I understand the gist of your question, I agree with you that he is exploiting, and I think very skillfully and with an intelligence which it's a mistake to underestimate, trends in U.S. history. So he knows very well how to manipulate racism without using the words that you're not supposed to use in public. The whole notion to which I referred before, the sadopopulism, where it's about hurting other people. You can hurt a little bit yourself, but other people are going to hurt more. If I don't have health insurance, okay, but like those black people are going to suffer even more without health insurance. That's the logic, but no one will ever say it like that. That he is riding on all of that for sure. When he told his big lie in late 2020 about the last presidential election that he had won, he wasn't just saying the Democrats had a conspiracy and cheated me. He was saying, in particular, in the big cities, in Philadelphia, Atlanta, Detroit, cities where by no coincidence whatsoever, African Americans live in large numbers, he was saying the black people cheated. But more than that, it was implicitly their votes shouldn't really count. So if their votes somehow swung the election, then the election itself is not legitimate. And he never says that word for word, right? But it comes through. He's riding, of course, on all of that. And the thing you're calling illiberalism, I mean, there's never, you would never want to say like there was a moment when the American population was liberal, right? Like there are these tendencies and he's working on them. But at the same time, there are things that are different about him, and some of them are why he's worked so well. So we have not had someone who has used this kind of language before. We haven't had a president who has talked about the enemies within, which is probably something I should have cited when I was doing the fascism riff. We have not had a president or presidential candidate talk about vermin, right? We have not had someone who seems to be reading, Nazi speeches from the 20s and 30s in a normative way, right? In a kind of neutral, exploratory, oh, this might work kind of way. That hasn't happened before. We've had plenty of racists and misogynists, and we've had plenty of horrible language among presidential candidates. But that specific thing, the vermin, the enemies within, the idea that the U.S. military should be used against people who vote against him, we haven't had that before. That's new. And of course, this notion of the hustler or the grifter who rises to the top does have a place in American literature and American culture, but I would say we haven't had someone who has exemplified it so purely before. I mean, this is someone whose entire success depends upon persuading you that he's a success. Like that's it. Like it's all one big circle. And in the middle of that circle, there's just nothing, not even money. There's not even money there. He doesn't even have any money. It's just a circle, right? And so like you can think, okay, H.L. Mencken and, you know, the Roaring Twenties, we've had things like this before, but never this pure degree. So I just want to say both, that it's sure, U.S. history pushes towards this. And you know, and there's a way which is hard to define because you can't poll for it because Americans are very careful about their language. But there's obviously a way in which the racism and the misogyny made it harder for Harris to push through, right? And that's old. But Trump's way of using those things, and also the sharpness, right? Like no one else has talked about being a dictator for a day. No one said that. Like that, the positive valuation of dictator, or the negative valuation of the United States, like referring to the United States as a trash heap. You know, that sort of, that's new. We haven't had that before. So both is my answer.
Yes. Are we seeing the collapse of the American empire and the end of America as #1 country?
It's so. Let me address that indirectly. One of the things which is so different, being in you know your fair land, is that Canadians are constantly complaining about Canada, right? Like, you know, you just like if you don't have much energy for small talk, you just say TTC, and then like the other, and then the Canadian will hold up their end of the conversation, you know, till you're done with breakfast. Whereas when you're in America, you're constantly struggling with this. You're constantly struggling with, well, of course we're great, and of course it's freedom, and of course guardrails. Like every time I hear, like, it takes a day off my life every time I hear about the guardrails. You know, we have all these powerful inbuilt rationalizations that prevent us from seeing what's happening, and so those formulations are very close to the way I see things, but they're not very close to the way that Americans generally see things. A lot of Harris's voters, interestingly, did vote on democracy itself. And this was such a hard thing for her campaign. So now can get into a little bit of like the gossip and stuff, but it was such a hard thing for her campaign because Biden clearly cared about the American Republic, a very old-fashioned thing, right? And Harris clearly did too in her way. But she didn't want to run on that. She wanted to run as not being Biden, and she wanted to run on the future, which I think was tactically smart, or at least it seemed to be tactically smart. And then she got to the end, and in her own internal polling, she was losing, right, talking about the future. And so the last few days, she circled back, right, to talking about the end of the American Republic. And you know, I think factually she was right. I don't even know if tactically she was wrong. That's beyond my expertise, but certainly a lot of people are thinking this way in the U.S., but not the typical person, which kind of sets us up for what comes next, because so much hangs, I was trying to suggest at the end, on how people greet things when they happen. So Insurrection Act, for example. I want people to talk about the Insurrection Act all the time. I want people to talk about the Insurrection Act every day, because if you talk about it, then you won't have the luxury of being shocked, right? Because shock is a luxury. Shock is a luxury. Shock is the thing that you feel before you do nothing, right? Those are the two steps. First step is shock, second step is inaction. And so if you talk about the Insurrection Act every day, then on February 6th, when he invokes it, you're going to be like, yeah, we expected this, and maybe we even have a plan, right? We don't have the luxury of shock, because he most likely will invoke the Insurrection Act over some triviality. It probably won't be quite as trivial as in South Korea, but it will be close, right? It'll, you know, there'll be a deportation action in Philadelphia, and somebody will fall down the stairs, and he'll invoke the Insurrection Act, and he'll say, like, a fine policeman fell down the stairs today, or something along those lines, right? And there'll be the Insurrection Act. But if we make it banal, then when it comes, we can resist it or laugh at it, right? And so we're not there yet, but for me, it hangs on how we react to these things like deportation. how are people going to react to deportation? You know, again, like it depends a lot on how you think about it ahead of time. If you think this is a spectacle designed to make us hate one another and to weaken the republic, which it is in my view, then maybe you will react to it the right way, but you know, maybe you won't. The thing which worries, the two things which I didn't talk about, which worry me the most about the American Republic and its future are, one of them is super banal, the civil service. So, you know, there are roughly 50,000 people who execute the laws as part of the various branches, for the various parts of the executive branch. And one thing which Trump was doing on the way out last time, and this is the essence of Project 2025 for this time, but he was already doing it last time, again, to kind of, I'm trying to normalize this, if this could happen. They were going to classify all those civil servants as being political appointees, which means that once they're so reclassified, they can then be fired at the discretion of the president. So they could fire the entire American civil service. And that could be the end of the republic, or lead to it, because, again, this is something Americans don't see, but actually it takes human beings to create potable water and breathable air and drivable roads and all these things. Like the government really is doing things for you, not as much as it should be, but it's doing a lot. And so this could lead to the kind of disruptions which I think could, like very specific scenarios, right? Because California could say, well, actually our civil service is doing okay at this point. Why should we be sending all of our tax dollars to Washington when we need a better civil service now because there's none in Washington? But also just things falling apart, right? And then the other thing which really troubles me in terms of the future of the American Republic, so the number one thing, you know, you guys, anybody, I don't care, you guys be number one. Switzerland can be number one, whatever. Costa Rica can be number one as far as I'm concerned. Costa Rica's great. But in terms of the republic and its survival, the oligarchy really worries me. It really worries me that it's not clear that, you know, Trump, the wannabe oligarch, is in power, or Musk, the actual oligarch, is in power. That troubles me. It troubles me that you can see like this, that Musk is in charge of this, it's called DOGE, which is supposed to stand for Department of Governmental Efficiency, but I think of it as Den of Oligarchs Gets Everything, because the basic idea is to, you know, disassemble the government and then pick up the parts that you can give away profitably to your buddies. It's the regime proximate oligarch. I mean, this is something that one sees historically and has seen recently after 1989 or 1991 in Eastern Europe. Some oligarchs get close, and they're the ones who pick up the shiny, profitable bits. But the only way for those shiny, profitable bits to be on the ground is for the government to be broken up, right? And so Musk, with his radical libertarianism and with his quasi-official responsibilities, and then you see other oligarchs now clustering around this new department, that really worries me. No matter what happens, even in the best scenario, we're going to be way down for a while. Like, even if the American Republic exists in 4 years, which is, I think there should be a betting market on, there probably is, but even if we still exist and still have all the states, you know, 50 is a nice number, but there are other nice numbers, you know. So, I mean, 52 is the number I want. I want 52. I think DC should be a state and Puerto Rico should be a state. But, you know, there are other variants, right? Like, you guys get Washington, Oregon, you know, Minnesota. Vermont, right? Vermont's a good one. Yeah, you guys, there's this romance about New England, I've noticed. Okay, you can have New Hampshire too, why not, right? While we're doing it. But, you know, Maine, yeah, Maine's pretty. Yeah, but why did you guys get New Brunswick anyway? How did that happen? It seems like that should have gone the other way. Yeah, right. Well, what did we get? Yeah, anyway. See how easy it is to get started, right? See? Like, all of it, like the exact. Oh, see, there's the next step. There's the next. You know what? The Musk scenario could go many ways, but I'm afraid that's one way it's not going to go. Okay, so anyway, all non-joking aside, even in the best of scenarios, we're going to be way down. Way down. We won't have any kind of whatever international cachet normatively we had. We obviously don't have. But also just in terms of pure power politics, we have a president who simultaneously likes to hurt people at home, but to yield to dictators abroad. And it's very hard to be number one in any sense when you like for North Korea to tell you what to do or Russia to tell you what to do, right? Which Trump seems to like for whatever mysterious reasons. Okay. Were there questions from the internet that we were going to have, or did that?
There were, they would be listed there, and we haven't seen them yet.
Oh, okay.
None so far.
Just want to ask general comments about what happens to the Ukraine and United States and Russia, and in terms of the current conflict and what will be the outcome.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this, in a way, I mean, it speaks very much to Margaret Atwood's question, at least if the way that I see the world is right. Because in the way that I see the world, Ukrainian resistance is one of the things which keeps a lot of pieces in place. So when we think about the war in Ukraine, we can, of course, be thinking about its illegality and its atrocities, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, the murder of local elites. We can be thinking about the total destruction of cities. But even if one isn't thinking about those things and one is being a very selfish Canadian or American or European, or in my view, just pretty much anyone, what the Ukrainians are doing has been, in a kind of supererogatory, like almost unbelievable way, holding other things back. I think the way that I would tell the story of the last 3 years from outside Ukraine would be the Ukrainians have been holding a lot of things back. I mean, the Russian army, obviously, but they've been holding back the general idea that borders are meaningless and going to world order, right? Whether you want to characterize it as an empire or not, the where we are since 1945 is the idea that, your border with the United States is meaningful. Like, it would be bad if we took Manitoba, right? Like, you would, well, okay, I'm going to find out, like, who likes which provinces. But this notion is actually, historically speaking, quite new, that there are sovereign states and that there are borders, and the borders aren't going to change. And that is the international legal order in which we live. And of course, there have been exceptions, but actually numerically, they're not that many. And Russia invading Ukraine and annexing territory is a pretty big violation of this order, right? And if it's okay for Russia to take Crimea, or Russia to take eastern Ukraine, or Russia to destroy Ukraine and take whatever it wants, then it's also okay, obviously, for China to invade Taiwan. It's okay for African states to invade one another. It's okay. It's anything then goes, right? And the Ukrainians have been holding that back. And I think, secondly, they actually have been holding China back, as the Taiwanese keep trying to explain to Americans by showing how offensive wars are unpredictable and potentially embarrassing for leaders. I think the Ukrainians are speaking directly to Xi about the likelihood of what could happen to him if he tries to invade Taiwan, which until Ukraine, of course, was a scenario that the Americans and many other people were most worried about. And then there's nuclear proliferation. If Russia is able to win a war by way of nuclear blackmail, then everyone's going to build nuclear weapons. And that's not just a hypothesis. These plans are underway in several medium-sized powers, some of which are West-friendly, some of which are not. And they depend on how this war turns out, because if it turns out that the only way to defend yourself is to have a nuclear weapon, which is going to be the clearest lesson of Ukrainian defeat, then countries are going to have nuclear weapons. And we're going to be, statistically, mathematically, we're more likely to have nuclear war. So the Ukrainians are not to mention democracy, right? But the Ukrainians have been holding a lot of things back. Like, they're the ones, like, they're leaning against the dike. They're holding that flood back. And if we let them go, it's like the waters will rush over them first, but the waters will cover everything. And that's, I think, what a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic don't really understand. And so before I even get to try to answer your question, I just want to make clear how big I think the stakes are of that question. Now, the problem is that the way in which I've just framed this is totally alien to most of the people in the incoming Trump administration, or whatever we want to call it. For people like, for people like Tulsi Gabbard, Syrian atrocities and Russian atrocities in Syria are totally normal and have to be defended. For people like Elon Musk, Putin is right about everything and he is a hero and should be celebrated. And for Pete Hegseth, who I don't think is going to be the nominee for Secretary of Defense for much longer, but for people like him, the United States military is to be the site of a domestic gender war in which he expels all the women and purges the generals, and then the de-wokeified, as he sees it, American armed forces will be ready for those deportation actions and for what he calls in his books a holy war against the Democrats. People like that are not set up psychologically or any other way to support Ukraine against Russia, right? And so the kind of arguments that I'm making about world order or proliferation or whatever aren't really going to, I'm afraid, aren't going to really speak to these people. To some people like Marco Rubio, they will probably speak. To Trump, they won't speak, right? So what the nice Republicans tell me, and may they be right, may they be right. What the nice Republicans tell me is that Trump will change his tune about Ukraine once he realizes that Putin is trying to bully him, and he will realize the only way that to save face is to help the Ukrainians more than Biden. I report that. It's not what I personally believe. What I personally believe is that the Ukrainians will be fighting with what Biden is giving them now until spring. And by spring or maybe summer, there will be a reckoning, and much is going to depend on how Russia, the Russian economy, because right now the Russians want to fight and the Ukrainians have to resist, and there's just literally no way Trump can come in and say, I'm going to end the war in a day, which is his promise. He can't do it. He doesn't have any partners in that venture. But in 6 months from now, when Russia might be weaker or Ukraine might be losing or whatever, things could be different. The only scenario which works is the one where Trump realizes that this is going to humiliate him personally, I think, right? That this would be his Afghanistan times 100. That's the hope, right? That's the hope. That's about as good as it gets. I wish I had more to offer there.
There's actually an online question.
Okay. Okay. So I want to engage that question not a level of solution, because it's so easy to push things like that away and say well, that's not possible, or it's not, technically achievable, or that's too radical. I want to engage with it at the level which I think makes sense, which is the level of what we really mean by freedom. So Americans, so that was my American we. I don't know what you mean by, I don't know. I'm sure I'll learn. But what Americans mean by freedom is a kind of, is an absence, right? It's an absence. We have a negative idea of freedom. And that's part of what got us into this fix. Because if you have a negative idea of freedom, then you conclude that the government can't do anything for you. And the government is always negative. And that leads you to a situation where institutions don't work and income flattens and so on. And then there's more frustration and more emotion to direct against the government. And then you get the libertarian fascist toggle where people shift, as many of us have done, from saying, well, the government's the problem to my neighbor's the problem. The middle stage is the system. The government's the problem. The system is the problem. My neighbor is the problem, right? And so what I'm trying to say now, and I'm trying to speak with the questioner as though he were here, because there's something important inside the question. That is not anarchism, right? That's this kind of dark economic libertarianism, which a lot of the Silicon Valley people favor for obvious reasons, which goes back to the picking up the pieces, right? They favor it because they want the government to break. And they don't want to pay taxes tomorrow, but the day after tomorrow, they want the government to break so they can pick up the pieces. But the notion of anarchism has a positive idea of freedom, or it can, depending on which variant we're talking about, where you say, okay, in order for us to be free, it's not about the distant power, right, one way or the other. It's about our forming some kind of local structure, like, for example, a discussion, right? A local structure in which I reinforce you, you reinforce me. There's some kind of way in which we all support each other. And within that, we can be free, right? Like that's a notion of freedom. And that notion of freedom, I think, is actually correct. Like, I don't think it can be applied on its own on a large-scale society like Canada or like the United States, but there's definitely something to it, right? There's definitely something to the notion that in order to be free, we have to be able to get along locally and have local structures and local things that work and local sentimentality. There's definitely something to that. So I want to respect the question at that level, because I think when we start, like if you read the book, sorry, I'm doing Jonathan's job. Jonathan's one who's supposed to say, go read the book. But if you read the book, like a lot of the way that I'm trying to get people to think about freedom in America is like this, that it can't be about just opposing the distant power. It has to be about becoming the kind of person that you can become, but you can only do that by way of actual corporeal, local kinds of connections. So I'm kind of in favor of the sort of freedom that anarchists sometimes talk about. That's as far as I can go with that question.
Take maybe a few more.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask if you think there is any likelihood at all that between now and not long in the future, the American military might intervene and potentially Donald Trump and Steve Miller and Steve Bannon would end up in jail for sedition.
No, I don't. I think it's an interesting question because the U.S. armed forces, which I'm not going to claim to understand in any great depth, are sociologically quite distinct from both the rest of the federal government and the citizenry as a whole. And they occupy this kind of interesting constitutional space where they are on the one side, it's a hierarchically organized organization and they go off to war, for whatever reason without congressional authorization, just because the president says so. But at the same time, the oath they swear is to the Constitution and not to a leader. And the idea that they would be used against American citizens is in fact anathema to at least much of the high command, I would say. So I don't think that there's going to be a military coup against Trump or Bannon or Miller, but there are a couple other interesting things sociologically about the U.S. Armed Forces. One is that they're one of the most meritocratic institutions we have. So a lot of the men and women who are at the top of the military are people who do not come from money, but who have actually made it to the top by way of merit, and that's not so usual. Of course, it's in Canadian institutions of higher education. It's the rule, of course. I'm learning from your laughter, that's something that makes the U.S. military a bit different from the kind of plutocracy which I think we're likely to see, right? Like those men and women have a different kind of biography than a Musk or a Trump. And so they see the world differently, which isn't to say they see it like, an opinion writer for The Guardian sees it, but they see it differently. And then the third thing, which is sociologically interesting about the U.S. Armed Forces, is that they are one of our few well-integrated racially institutions, which means that deploying them in certain ways, like assuming you get across the hump and you're trying to deploy them domestically, there are certain ways of deploying them domestically which are going to cause dissent, right? And so, a disproportionate share of the U.S. military, for example, is from Latin American background. So using them, you would have to be a little bit careful about using them in deportation actions, right? So there's some interesting things about the U.S. military. I don't think one of those interesting things is that they're plotting a coup, but I do think one of the interesting things is that since November 6th, they are talking amongst themselves about how they would react to the Insurrection Act. And that's one of the reasons why I want everyone to talk about it, because they're talking about it because some of them are thinking about when they're going to say no, right? And so then that forces Trump and his Secretary of Defense or whoever it is into a more and more extensive purge to get down to the people who will say yes. But the more purging they have to do and the longer it takes, the harder it then becomes to actually do the thing that they want to do. So that's as much as I can say about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I think we're going to take one more question for now. I got a question.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm here. Is there a risk that Trump will not leave at the end of his term?
Is there a risk that Trump will not leave at the end of his term? I like the polite way that you formulated that question. I think the way I would formulate it if our rules were reversed would be, can you imagine a scenario in which Trump would willingly leave after 4 years? And I think that's the challenge. We're talking about somebody who has referred, and I'm with Freud, there's no such thing as a joke, who has joked repeatedly about serving more than 2 terms. We're talking about somebody who, when he lost the last time, tried to stay in office. If you believe his own logic, he was president already for 2 terms, and so this is already his 3rd term, which is an argument I expect them to make, by the way, that the 22nd Amendment has already been violated because, look, this is already his 3rd term. He is somebody who has openly talked about changing the 22nd Amendment so he could serve, but even more fundamentally than that, and this is like going down to basic tyranny 101, he wants to die in bed, and he wants that bed to be a nice bed. The beds in the White House are very nice. That's it. Fundamentally, down to the ground, what he needs is not to die in prison. And the White House isn't prison, right? He's in the same boat with the Putins and the Netanyahus and all these people who've committed lots of crimes, where fundamentally it's about not going to prison. And in Trump's case, secondarily, it's about finally making money and being wealthy. So I think the case, you really have to make the case that he would leave, because I honestly don't see why he would, right? Even his first conversation with the House of Representatives, he said, well, I'll be leaving in 4 years unless you don't want me to, ha, 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 right? So no, my assumption, and this is why I hesitate before I say Trump administration, because the whole term, that polite American English administration, the notion that you're just coming to administer something for 4 years and then the thing itself will go on. I just don't think he or his people think about it that way. I don't think they think of it as an administration. I think they think about it as power, as personal power to be maintained for as long as possible. So no, I'm hoping that enough things go badly for him in the first few months that it will seem obvious that we're going to have midterm elections, and then we'll kind of go from there. I'm happy to take more questions if you want, but I'm also happy not to.
We will remember. So
yeah, well,
So I want to just close the official proceedings by thanking Professor Snyder for a remarkable talk. Thank you so much. I'm sure there will be many more questions to come.
Okay, so I go.